They say courage is not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. I believed that once. I was Zarthek of the Voidstalkers, elite hunter of the Galactic Coalition, bred for war and tempered in the fires of 1,000 battles across star systems. Fear was a concept I understood only in theory, something lesser species experienced before we ended their existence. Then, I fought alongside humans. In the depths of space, where ancient horrors older than civilizations had awakened to reclaim the galaxy, I discovered something that shattered everything I thought I knew. About courage, about warfare, and about the strange, stubborn species called humanity. What I witnessed in those desperate battles didn't just change the course of the war, it changed me forever. This is the account of how a race we dismissed as weak newcomers taught the galaxy's greatest warriors what true strength means, and how standing beside them in humanity's darkest hour, I learned to fear for the first time in my life. Not fear of death, not fear of defeat, but something far more profound. The fear of failing those who showed us that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in how you fight, but in who you choose to fight for. The first time I saw a human warrior fall, I thought it was weakness. I was wrong. Commander Zarthek's claws clicked against the reinforced deck plating of the Coalition flagship, Eternal Dominion, as he reviewed the tactical displays floating before him. 3 rotations had passed since the ancient enemy, the Devourers, had emerged from their million-year slumber in the galactic core. Already, 17 star systems had gone dark, their populations consumed, or converted into the writhing biomass that fed the enemy's endless hunger. "Status report," Zarthek commanded, his 6 eyes scanning the holographic battle formations. His subordinate, Lieutenant Kex Val, approached with the measured gait typical of their species. "The outer rim defenses have fallen at Kepler. 442. The Devourer's advance continues unchecked. Admiral Tharon estimates we have perhaps 2 standard months before they reach the core worlds." Kexval's mandibles clicked nervously. The Admiral has also received word from the Coalition Council. They're integrating human forces into our battle groups. Zarthek's primary arms twitched in annoyance. Humans, the newest species to join the Galactic Coalition barely 3 centuries since first contact. They possessed no natural armor, no enhanced physiology, no psionic abilities. Their technology was functional but unremarkable. Most Coalition species viewed them as useful for manual labor and basic support roles, nothing more. Humans? Zartek's voice carried the same tone he might use to discuss maintenance drones. What possible contribution could they make to a battle of this magnitude? Unknown, Commander. Admiral Theron's orders are explicit. We're to accept human attachments to our strike forces immediately. The communications array chimed with an incoming transmission. The holographic form of Admiral Theron, a towering Zeraki with crystalline skin that reflected the bridge's lighting, materialized before them. "Commander Zarthek, you will proceed to Station Omega 7 immediately. Your squadron will be reinforced with human elements before deployment to the Arcturus front. Time is critical. The Devourers have begun mobilizing what our scouts describe as a harvest fleet toward that sector." Section 9. Acknowledged, Admiral. May I inquire about the tactical reasoning behind this integration? Admiral Theron's 6 crystalline fingers drummed against an unseen surface. The humans requested combat assignments. Given their losses in the outer territories, the Council felt it appropriate to honor their request. Consider it a diplomatic necessity. The transmission ended, leaving Zarthek contemplating this development. The Voidstalkers were elite warriors, each one capable of single-handedly clearing an enemy ship. They had trained together for decades, their tactics honed to perfection. Adding untested aliens to their unit seemed counterproductive at best, dangerous at worst. Station Omega. The massive structure served as a staging ground for Coalition forces, its docking bays filled with vessels from dozens of species. Zarthek noted the smaller angular ships that must belong to the human contingent. Unremarkable in design, functional rather than elegant. As Zarthek's transport docked, he gathered his squad of 12 Voidstalkers in the cargo bay. Each warrior stood 3 meters tall, their obsidian exoskeletons gleaming under the harsh station lighting. Weapons and equipment were integrated into their bodies, retractable blade arms, plasma cannon mounts, targeting systems directly linked to their neural networks. Listen well, Zarthek addressed his warriors. We are about to be joined by human elements. They lack our capabilities and training. Our primary objective remains unchanged. Eliminate the Devourer threat. Secondary objective, ensure the humans do not impede our mission effectiveness. The airlock opened with a sharp hiss, and Zarthek's first surprise came in the form of the human delegation's leader. Instead of the soft, pale creatures he had seen in diplomatic recordings, this human possessed a presence that immediately caught his attention. Captain Sarah Chen stood barely 2 meters tall, but she carried herself with an unmistakable authority. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes, those strange, forward-facing human eyes, met his gaze directly, without the deference he expected from a junior species. "Commander Zarthek," she said, extending one of her small 5-fingered hands. "Captain Chen, Terra Defense Corps, 1st Expeditionary Battalion. My unit is ready for integration." Behind her stood 20 human soldiers, each wearing powered armor that, while clearly advanced, appeared primitive compared to Zarthek's integrated weapon systems. They carried separate weapons, rifles, sidearms, various tools and equipment. Everything about them seemed inefficient by Coalition standards. Zarthek regarded the outstretched hand with curiosity. Physical contact between species was typically avoided for practical reasons. Different atmospheric requirements, varying gravity tolerances, incompatible biological systems. Yet something in the human's direct gaze suggested this gesture held significance beyond mere greeting. He extended one massive claw and carefully grasped her hand. The human's grip was surprisingly firm, her small fingers wrapping around his armored digit with what seemed like deliberate pressure. "Captain Chen," he acknowledged, "I trust your forces understand the gravity of our mission. The Devourers show no mercy to any species." "We're aware of the threat, Commander. My people have been fighting them for 6 months on the Outer Rim. We've learned a few things about their tactics and weaknesses." This gave Zarthek pause. "You have engaged the Devourers in direct combat?" "Multiple engagements. Lost 3 colonies before we figured out how to hurt them effectively." Quote. Her expression hardened. "We're here because we know what we're up against, and we know how to kill them." Over the next several hours, Zarthek observed the human integration process with growing confusion. Rather than simply accepting assignment to support roles, the humans insisted on detailed tactical briefings. They asked questions that demonstrated not just understanding of their enemy, but insights that even experienced coalition commanders had missed. The Devourer's sensory organs are vulnerable to specific electromagnetic frequencies, Captain Chen explained during the strategy session. Their biomass is constantly regenerating, but if you disrupt their neural coordination at the right moment, you can create cascade failures in their larger forms. Lieutenant Commander Torres, Chen's second-in-command, added, "We've also discovered they have difficulty adapting to rapid tactical changes. Hit them fast, from multiple directions, and they default to basic predatory responses instead of coordinated attacks." Zarthek found himself grudgingly impressed by their tactical analysis, though he remained skeptical about their combat effectiveness. The proof would come soon enough. The mission briefing revealed the scope of their challenge. Intelligence indicated a major devourer biomass concentration in the Arcturus system, centered around what had once been the thriving colony world of New Geneva. The creatures had converted the planet's entire population into raw material for constructing what appeared to be a massive organic space station, a breeding ground that could spawn millions of attack forms if allowed to mature. Tactical assessment suggests a 3-pronged assault. Admiral Theron's image explained via secure transmission. Primary strike teams will target the station's core structures, while secondary forces engage the defensive organisms. Commander Zarthek, your combined unit will spearhead the primary assault. After the briefing, Zarthek found himself alone with Captain Chen in the observation deck overlooking the docking bays. Through the reinforced transparisteel, they watched as Coalition and human vessels prepared for departure. "Commander," Chen said, her voice carrying an undertone he couldn't quite identify, "I want you to know that my people understand what we're walking into. We know the casualty projections." "Combat always involves acceptable losses," Zarthek replied automatically. "Efficient tactics minimize such concerns." Chen turned to face him, those strange human eyes focusing on his with an intensity that was somehow unsettling. "No, Commander. There are no acceptable losses. Every person we lose is someone's parent, child, friend, lover. When we go into battle, we carry that weight." Zarthek's mandibles clicked in what might have been confusion. Such emotional considerations would seem to impair combat effectiveness. "You'd think so," Chen said quietly. "But we've found it has the opposite effect. When you're fighting for something more than tactical objectives, when you're fighting for the people who matter to you, it changes everything." The journey to Arcturus took 4 standard days through hyperspace. During this time, Zarthek observed the human contingent with growing interest. Unlike coalition forces who typically maintained professional distance, the humans seemed to form complex social bonds with remarkable speed. He watched them share meals together, an inefficient process that took far longer than necessary nutrient consumption. They engaged in recreational activities that served no apparent training purpose. Most puzzling, they spoke frequently about their lives before military service, about people waiting for their return, about hopes and plans for the future. It was during one such observation that Zarthek witnessed something that challenged his understanding of effective military organization. Sergeant Maria Santos, one of the human soldiers, had received word that her home colony had gone silent, likely overrun by devourer forces. Instead of maintaining professional composure, the human openly wept. Rather than censuring this display of emotional instability, her fellow soldiers gathered around her, offering physical comfort and verbal support. Captain Chen herself spent nearly an hour speaking with Santos privately. When Kexisval observed this scene, his comment reflected typical coalition thinking. Such emotional instability would result in immediate removal from active duty in any proper military organization. But Zarthek noticed something his lieutenant had missed. After that hour of what humans called grieving, Sergeant Santos returned to her duties with a focus and intensity that surpassed her previous performance. The support of her unit had not weakened her, it had somehow strengthened her resolve. The transition from hyperspace brought them face to face with the horror they had come to confront. What had once been New Geneva now resembled a massive, pulsing organ suspended in space. Grotesque appendages stretched for kilometers, twitching with obscene life. Smaller organic vessels, creatures bred for war, swarmed around the structure, like antibodies protecting a vital organ. "By the void," whispered one of Zarthek's warriors. Even hardened void stalkers were shaken by the sight. But as Zarthek glanced at the human soldiers, he saw something unexpected. Where he had anticipated fear or revulsion, he found grim determination. Captain Chen's jaw was set, her hands steady as she checked her equipment. Her soldiers showed similar resolve, not the absence of emotion, but emotion channeled into purpose. "All units, this is Admiral Theron. Commence attack pattern Omega-7. Primary objectives remain unchanged. Destroy the core biomass and prevent spore dispersal to other systems." The battle began with long-range engagement from the fleet's capital ships, massive energy beams striking the organic station's outer defenses. The structure convulsed and writhed, but its regenerative capabilities quickly began repairing the damage. Worse, the attacks triggered a response from the defensive organisms. Thousands of creatures ranging from fighter-sized parasites to massive tentacled horrors that dwarfed coalition destroyers. "Strike teams, you are clear for approach," came the tactical coordinator's voice. "Defensive screen is established. You have approximately 40 minutes before the next wave of organisms reaches combat range." Zartek's assault transport, carrying both his void stalkers and the human contingent, approached one of the station's primary access points, a sphincter-like opening that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. The structure's surface was covered in sensory organs and defensive turrets grown from what had once been sentient beings. As they prepared for boarding action, Zarthek addressed both groups. "Standard breach protocol. Void stalkers will establish the initial beachhead. Human forces will provide support and cover our advance to the core chamber." Captain Chen's response surprised him. "Negative, Commander. Respectfully, your standard protocols won't work against this enemy. We need to move fast and unpredictably. My people will take point. We know how these things think." Before Zarthek could object, the transport shuddered under impact from defensive fire. Through the viewports he saw organic projectiles, living ammunition that tried to burrow into the ship's hull, being burned away by the transport's defensive systems. "Breach in 30 seconds, called the pilot. "Whatever you're going to do, decide fast." Chen turned to her soldiers. "Remember Training Protocol 7. Fast, aggressive, unpredictable. These things expect us to behave like normal coalition forces, methodical and cautious. We're going to show them what humans do when we're angry." The transport's breaching charges detonated, creating an opening in the organic wall. Immediately, the gap began sealing itself, edges writhing as they sought to close. This was the critical moment. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the opening healed completely. What happened next would forever change Zarthek's understanding of human warfare. Instead of the careful, systematic breach he expected, the humans exploded through the opening with a ferocity that shocked even experienced void stalkers. Captain Chen led the charge, her weapon firing continuously as she advanced into the organic corridor beyond. Her soldiers followed in a coordinated rush that seemed chaotic but was clearly well rehearsed. The interior of the station was a nightmare of living architecture, walls that breathed, floors that shifted and moved, lighting provided by bioluminescent growths that pulsed with the structure's massive heartbeat. Defensive organisms emerged from concealed chambers, creatures that were once sentient beings, now twisted into weapons of living flesh and bone. Zarthek watched in amazement as the humans adapted to this environment with intuitive skill. Where his warriors relied on superior firepower and armor, the humans used speed, creativity, and something that took him several minutes to identify: rage. Not the berserker fury that led to tactical mistakes, but a cold, focused anger that drove them to fight with an intensity he had never witnessed. Sergeant Santos, still grieving her lost colony, fought with particular viciousness. She moved through the organic corridors like a force of nature, her weapon cutting down devourer organisms with methodical precision. When her rifle ran dry, she smoothly transitioned to secondary weapons. When those failed, she used explosives. When those were exhausted, she fought with blade and bare hands. "These things took everything from us," she said during a brief tactical pause, her voice carrying across the unit's communications. "Time to return the favor." As they pushed deeper into the station, Zartek began to understand what Captain Chen had meant about fighting for something more than tactical objectives. The humans weren't just soldiers following orders. They were people defending their species' right to exist. Every corridor they cleared, every organism they destroyed, was a step toward protecting their homes, their families, their future. The tactical difference was profound. Where coalition forces fought to complete missions, humans fought to win. The distinction seemed subtle, but its effects were unmistakable. They took risks that conventional military doctrine would consider excessive, but those risks were calculated based on an understanding that failure meant extinction. As they approached the station's core chamber, they encountered the first of the major defensive organisms, a massive creature that had once been an entire population center. Thousands of beings merged into a single, horrific entity. Its psychic screams battered their minds, trying to induce despair and surrender. Zartek felt his warriors falter under the mental assault. Even with their neural shielding, the creature's psychic power was overwhelming. Several Voidstalkers slowed their advance, their targeting systems disrupted by the psychic interference. But the humans pushed forward. Somehow, their unshielded minds seemed less affected by the creature's mental attacks. Later, Zarthak would learn this was because humans had evolved as persistence hunters, predators who could maintain focus and purpose even under extreme stress and exhaustion. "Concentrate fire on the neural clusters," Chen commanded. "Don't let it coordinate its attacks." The battle that followed was unlike anything in Zartek's military experience. The massive organism filled the chamber, its numerous appendages striking with crushing force while smaller parasites spawned from its body to attack the strike team. Coalition doctrine called for systematic targeting of weak points and careful maintenance of formation. The humans threw doctrine away and adapted to the moment. They spread out to present multiple targets, used the chamber's organic architecture to their advantage, and coordinated their attacks with an intuitive understanding of the creature's behavior patterns. When conventional weapons proved insufficient, they improvised, using the station's own biology against itself, turning its defensive systems into weapons, exploiting the creature's reflexive responses to create opportunities. Most remarkably, when Corporal Zhang was caught by one of the creature's appendages and seemed certain to be crushed, his squad mates immediately rushed to his aid. Not as part of standard tactical protocol, but because, as Sergeant Santos shouted over the noise of battle, "We don't leave people behind." They freed Zhang at considerable risk to themselves, then continued the fight with undiminished intensity. Zhang himself, despite being injured, refused evacuation and continued to provide covering fire for his unit. It was during this battle that Zartek experienced something he had never felt before in combat: concern for the safety of individual soldiers who were not part of his direct command structure. When Private Rodriguez was knocked unconscious by falling debris, Zartek found himself moving to provide protective cover without consciously making that tactical decision. The realization disturbed him deeply. Efficient military operations required leaders to view soldiers as resources to be utilized optimally. Emotional attachment to individual units led to tactical errors and mission failure. Yet watching the humans fight with such fierce dedication to each other, he found his own tactical calculations shifting to include their welfare. The core chamber battle raged for nearly an hour before the massive organism finally collapsed, its neural networks disrupted beyond recovery. As it died, the entire station began to convulse, its vital systems failing in cascade. "All units, withdraw immediately," Admiral Theron's voice crackled through the communication system. The structure is beginning to collapse. Evacuation window is less than 10 minutes. The retreat should have been orderly and systematic. Instead, as they raced through corridors that were literally disintegrating around them, Zartek witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Private Kim, one of the youngest humans in the unit, stumbled and fell as organic debris collapsed across her legs. She was trapped, and the structural damage made rescue appear impossible within the available time frame. Standard Coalition protocol was clear. When rescue attempts would endanger the mission and multiple personnel, individual soldiers were considered acceptable losses. Zartek prepared to order the unit to continue withdrawal, but Captain Chen had already stopped. "We're not leaving her," she said simply, and began organizing an immediate rescue effort. "Captain," Zartek called, "the tactical situation requires immediate withdrawal. Attempting rescue will risk the entire unit." Chen turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw something that changed everything he thought he understood about warfare, about leadership, and about the strange species called humanity. "Commander," she said quietly, "if we leave her behind, we're no better than the things we're fighting. What's the point of winning if we lose what makes us worth saving?" Without further discussion, she and her soldiers began cutting through the debris to reach their trapped comrade. They worked with desperate efficiency, using explosives, cutting tools, even their bare hands to clear a path. The station continued to collapse around them, organic matter raining from the ceiling, walls closing as the structure's death throes intensified. Zartek faced a choice that would define not just this mission, but his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. He could order his Voidstalkers to continue withdrawal, leaving the humans to their fate. It was the tactically sound decision, or he could commit his forces to a rescue operation that served no strategic purpose and risked valuable coalition assets. He thought about efficiency, about acceptable losses, about mission parameters and tactical doctrine. Then he thought about Sergeant Santos fighting for her lost colony, about Corporal Zhang's squad mates rushing into danger to save him, about Captain Chen's words, "What's the point of winning if we lose what makes us worth saving?" "Voidstalkers," he commanded, "assist the rescue operation. We extract everyone or no one." What followed was the most desperate 10 minutes of Zartek's military career. Coalition and human forces worked together with perfect coordination, their different capabilities complementing each other in ways no tactical manual could have predicted. Zartek's warriors provided the raw strength needed to move massive debris, while the humans' smaller size and flexibility allowed them to work in spaces the larger aliens couldn't access. They freed Private Kim with less than 2 minutes to spare, carrying her unconscious form as they raced through the collapsing station toward their extraction point. The transport was waiting, engines already spinning up for immediate departure. As they cleared the station's hull, the entire structure imploded behind them, collapsing into a dense mass that would pose no further threat to Coalition space. The mission was complete, the strategic objective achieved. But as Zartek looked around the transport's cargo hold, he realized that something far more significant had occurred. His Voidstalkers sat alongside the human soldiers, no longer maintaining the careful separation that marked most interspecies military operations. They were actually talking, about the battle, sharing observations, even engaging in what appeared to be casual conversation. More importantly, he realized that he was no longer thinking of the humans as auxiliary forces to be protected, or as inexperienced allies to be tolerated. They were his soldiers now, people he would fight beside again, people whose safety mattered to him in ways that defied tactical logic. Captain Chen found him standing at the transport's observation window, watching the debris field that had once been their enemy. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping with Kim." "It was the correct tactical decision," Zartek replied, though he knew that wasn't true. Chen smiled, an expression that transformed her features from merely determined to something approaching warmth. "No, Commander, it was the right thing to do. There's a difference." As their transport rejoined the fleet for the journey back to Coalition space, Zartek found himself contemplating that difference. For his entire military career, he had believed that tactical efficiency and moral correctness were identical concepts. Complete the mission, minimize casualties, utilize resources optimally. Simple equations with clear solutions. But watching the humans fight, seeing their fierce dedication to each other, witnessing their refusal to abandon anyone regardless of tactical considerations, he began to understand that there was something beyond efficiency, something that made victory meaningful rather than merely achievable. The humans called it honor, though their concept of honor was different from the martial codes of other Coalition species. It wasn't about personal glory or battlefield achievement. It was about the commitment to stand beside others, to protect not just strategic interests, but the lives and dignity of those who fought beside you. As he settled into his command chair for the long journey home, Zarthek realized that something fundamental had changed. He was no longer the same commander who had begrudgingly accepted human integration into his unit. The battle had forged something new, not just tactical cooperation, but genuine partnership. For the first time in his military career, he found himself looking forward to the next mission, not because of the tactical challenge it would present, but because he would face it alongside soldiers he had come to respect as equals. The humans had shown him that strength came not just from superior weapons or armor, but from the bonds formed between those who choose to stand together against the darkness. The war against the Devourers was far from over. Greater challenges lay ahead, battles that would test not just their tactical skills, but their commitment to the values they fought to preserve. But as Zarthek watched his mixed unit of coalition and human forces preparing their equipment and sharing stories of the battle, he knew they would face those challenges together. And for the first time in his life, he understood what Captain Chen had meant when she spoke about fighting for something more than tactical objectives. They were fighting for each other, for the right of all species to exist free from the horror they had just witnessed. It wasn't just about military victory. It was about preserving what made that victory worth achieving. The second time I saw humans fight, I began to understand the difference between winning and surviving. They taught me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never planned to fight. The celebration aboard the Eternal Dominion felt hollow to Commander Zarthek despite the mission's tactical success. Coalition forces had gathered in the main conference hall to commemorate the destruction of the New Geneva breeding station, but his thoughts remained fixed on the events that had transpired during their extraction. Admiral Theron's massive crystalline form dominated the central platform as he addressed the assembled officers. The elimination of the breeding facility represents a significant strategic victory. Intelligence estimates suggest we have delayed the Devourer's expansion timeline by at least 6 standard months. Polite acknowledgement rippled through the gathering, the formal clicking, humming, and harmonic tones of various species expressing approval. Yet Zarthek noticed the human contingent remained unusually quiet. Captain Chen stood with her officers along the hall's periphery, their expressions thoughtful rather than celebratory. After the formal ceremony concluded, Zarthek approached the human delegation. Captain Chen was reviewing casualty reports on a portable display, her features marked by the kind of focused concentration he had come to associate with human tactical analysis. "Captain, your forces performed admirably during the operation," he offered, unsure why he felt compelled to acknowledge their contribution beyond standard protocol. Chen looked up from her reports, and he noticed the exhaustion in her eyes, not physical fatigue, but the deeper weariness that came from carrying responsibilities beyond military parameters. "Thank you, Commander. Though I'm not sure admirably captures what we learned today. The mission objectives were achieved with minimal casualties," Zarthek stated, reciting the standard metrics for operational success.
Minimal.
Chen repeated the word with an inflection that suggested multiple meanings. "We saved Private Kim? Yes. But 3 colonies went dark while we were destroying that breeding station. 47,000 people, Commander. That's not minimal to their families." The observation puzzled Zarthek. Military operations necessarily involve broader strategic considerations. Individual tactical successes could not be evaluated based on simultaneous events beyond their scope of influence. Yet something in Chen's tone suggested she was applying different assessment criteria entirely. "Captain, tactical units cannot be held responsible for strategic developments outside their operational parameters," he said. Offering what seemed like obvious clarification, Chen's expression shifted, and for a moment he glimpsed something that might have been surprise. "Is that how coalition forces evaluate mission success? Pure tactical metrics without broader context?" Before he could respond, Lieutenant Commander Torres approached with an urgent communication device. "Captain, priority message from Terra Command. Admiral Morrison wants immediate consultation on the Kepler situation." Chen accepted the device and activated its holographic display. The image that materialized showed a human officer whose weathered features spoke of extensive combat experience. Behind him, Zarthek could see what appeared to be a tactical operations center filled with urgent activity. "Sarah, we need your assessment of Devourer adaptation patterns. The creatures that hit Kepler 442 use tactics we haven't seen before. They're learning from our previous engagements." Captain Chen's attention focused completely on the display. "Show me the engagement recordings." What followed was a detailed analysis session that revealed capabilities Zarthek had not fully appreciated. The humans didn't simply review battle data, they dissected it with an analytical intensity that rivaled the Coalition's best strategic computers. More importantly, they approached the analysis from perspectives that traditional military doctrine wouldn't consider. Here, Chen indicated a specific sequence in the recording. The Devourers adapted their attack formation mid-battle. They abandoned standard predatory patterns and began using coordinated flanking maneuvers. That's not instinctive behavior, that's learned tactical adaptation. Admiral Morrison's expression grew increasingly grave. Exactly what we feared. The enemy is evolving beyond biological imperatives. If they can adapt tactically in real time, then every engagement teaches them how to fight us more effectively, Torres concluded. We're training our own enemy. The implications struck Zarthek with sudden clarity. Coalition tactical doctrine relied heavily on established patterns and proven strategies. If their enemy could learn and adapt to those patterns, traditional military approaches might become not just ineffective, but counterproductive. What do you recommend? Admiral Morrison asked. Chen's response revealed thinking that operated on entirely different principles from Coalition strategic planning. We need to stop fighting like a military and start fighting like humans. Unpredictability, emotional decision-making, irrational tactical choices. The things we're usually trained to avoid might be our greatest advantages. Elaborate. The Devourers analyze our behavior and adapt to it, but they're trying to understand logical, efficient, tactical thinking. If we make decisions based on factors they can't quantify, loyalty, revenge, sacrifice, hope, they can't predict our actions accurately. Zarthek found himself deeply engaged by this analysis, though it challenged fundamental assumptions about effective warfare. You propose deliberately introducing inefficiency into military operations? Chan turned to include him in the conversation, her expression suggesting genuine interest in his perspective. Not inefficiency, Commander. Humanity. The Devourers can calculate tactical probabilities, but they can't understand why someone would risk everything to save a single trapped soldier, or why a defeated unit would continue fighting against impossible odds. The conversation continued for another hour, during which Zarthek observed a form of strategic planning unlike anything in Coalition doctrine. The humans didn't just analyze tactical data. They considered psychological factors, emotional motivations, cultural influences, and what they termed human nature as legitimate strategic variables. More troubling, their analysis suggested that humanity's apparent tactical disadvantages might actually represent advantages against an enemy that learned through behavioral pattern recognition. Humans' tendency toward emotional decision-making, their refusal to abandon casualties, their willingness to attempt impossible rescue operations, these seeming inefficiencies might be the very qualities that made them unpredictable to an adaptive enemy. When the consultation ended, Chen deactivated the communication device and turned back to Zarthek. Commander, I want to ask you something. When you decided to help rescue Private Kim, what factors influenced that decision? The question seemed simple, but felt loaded with implications he couldn't fully grasp. The tactical situation required maintaining unit cohesion, he began, then stopped. That wasn't accurate, and somehow lying to Chen felt inappropriate. Actually, it seemed necessary. Not tactically necessary, just necessary. Exactly. Chen's smile suggested he had provided the correct answer to a test he hadn't known he was taking. That's the kind of decision-making the Devourers can't understand or predict. It's not based on logic or efficiency. It's based on something they don't possess, which is the ability to care about individual lives more than strategic objectives. Over the following days, as their fleet repositioned for the next phase of operations, Zarthek found himself observing human behavior with new interest. What he had initially interpreted as tactical inefficiency, he began to recognize as a different form of strategic thinking entirely. The humans maintained elaborate social rituals that served no apparent military purpose. They shared personal photographs and stories, celebrated individual achievements, mourned losses together, and engaged in recreational activities that built no useful skills. Yet these seemingly wasteful activities created bonds that translated directly into combat effectiveness. During their next engagement, a rescue operation to evacuate survivors from a besieged research station, Zarthek witnessed the practical applications of this approach. The mission parameters were straightforward. Extract valuable scientific personnel and equipment before Devourer forces overran the facility. Standard Coalition protocol would have prioritized the evacuation order based on personnel value and equipment significance. Scientists would be extracted first, followed by technical staff. with general personnel and non-essential materials abandoned if time constraints required it. The humans approached the operation differently. Captain Chen's briefing focused not on personnel classifications but on individuals. She knew the names of key research staff, understood their personal relationships, and factored emotional bonds into tactical planning. When it became clear that extraction time would be limited, her decisions reflected considerations that no coalition manual would include. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the station's lead researcher, refused evacuation unless her entire team could be extracted together. Coalition protocol would have classified this as emotional irrationality requiring override by military authority. Instead, Chen adapted the tactical plan to accommodate Warren's requirements, arguing that a research team's effectiveness depended on maintaining its social structure. Dr. Farb was the policeman. Warren's team has worked together for 8 years, Chen explained to Zartek during their approach to the station. Their productivity isn't just based on individual expertise, it's based on trust, communication patterns, shared experience. Separate them and you lose more than you save. The logic seemed questionable until Zartek observed the evacuation process firsthand. Rather than the chaotic scramble he expected, the humans moved with coordinated efficiency that exceeded standard coalition evacuation protocols. Because Chen had considered personal relationships in her planning, people knew exactly where their colleagues were, what equipment needed priority, and how to support each other during the extraction. More significantly, when they encountered unexpected resistance from devourer organisms that had infiltrated the station ahead of schedule, the research team's social bonds translated into immediate tactical advantages. Scientists provided critical information about station layout and defensive capabilities. Technical staff improvised weapons and barriers. Even administrative personnel contributed meaningfully to the defense effort. The evacuation that should have taken 3 hours required only 90 minutes, and they extracted every person along with significantly more equipment than initial projections suggested possible. The difference came not from superior tactics or technology, but from humans' ability to function as a coordinated social unit rather than a collection of individual assets. During the extraction, Zarthek found himself working alongside Dr. Warren's research team to evacuate critical experimental data. As they moved through corridors threatened by devourer infiltration, he noticed something that challenged his understanding of human psychology under stress. Rather than the panic and reduced efficiency he expected from civilian personnel, the researchers displayed remarkable calm and focus. They worked together with practiced coordination, supporting each other physically and emotionally while maintaining operational effectiveness. When graduate student Michael Chen, no relation to the captain, was injured by falling debris, the team's response demonstrated principles Zarthek was beginning to understand. Instead of abandoning the wounded individual or assigning minimal personnel to his care, the entire team adapted their movement pattern to accommodate his injury. They created an improvised stretcher, adjusted their route to minimize physical stress, and maintained constant communication to ensure his psychological comfort. The additional effort required should have significantly reduced their evacuation speed. Instead, Michael Chen continued to contribute critical knowledge about the station's layout and emergency systems. His teammates, motivated by concern for his welfare, worked with enhanced focus and efficiency. The injured student himself refused pain medication that would impair his cognitive function, insisting on helping guide their escape route through areas only he knew well. The result was an evacuation that moved faster and more effectively than if they had followed standard protocols for managing casualties. The human approach of prioritizing individual welfare had produced superior tactical results through mechanisms no coalition manual described. As they reached the extraction point, Zarthek realized he was experiencing something unprecedented in his military career. He genuinely cared whether these specific individuals, Dr. Warren, Michael Chen, the research team members whose names he had learned, survived the evacuation, not as valuable assets or tactical resources, but as individuals whose continued existence mattered to him personally. The feeling was profoundly disturbing. Military effectiveness required objective decision-making based on strategic value and tactical necessity. Emotional attachment to specific personnel created vulnerabilities that enemy forces could exploit. Coalition doctrine emphasized maintaining professional distance precisely to avoid such complications. Yet watching the humans work together, seeing how their personal bonds translated into enhanced operational capabilities, he began to question whether coalition doctrine might be missing critical elements of effective warfare. Perhaps the humans' approach wasn't a dangerous liability, but a strategic advantage that coalition forces had never learned to utilize. The extraction proceeded smoothly until they reached the final checkpoint before the evacuation transport. Sensors detected a massive devourer organism moving toward their position, something far larger than the infiltration forms they had encountered earlier. Analysis suggested they had perhaps 5 minutes before the creature reached the extraction point. Standard protocol required immediate departure with available personnel. The transport could accommodate everyone they had already evacuated, and attempting to wait for additional survivors would risk the entire operation. Zarthek prepared to order immediate takeoff. Captain Chen's response challenged his tactical assumptions once again. Transport, hold position. All units maintain overwatch. We're not leaving until we confirm no additional survivors remain in the station. Captain, Zarthek interjected. Tactical analysis indicates that organism will reach this position within 5 minutes. Risk assessment suggests immediate departure. Chen's expression reflected the same determination he had observed during Private Kim's rescue. Commander, our sensors show movement in the lower levels. There might be people down there. We don't leave until we know. The tactical situation requires prioritizing confirmed personnel over theoretical survivors, Zarthek stated, invoking standard coalition doctrine. The human situation requires making sure we've done everything possible, Chen responded. Torres, take a team and sweep the lower levels, fast but thorough. What followed was 3 minutes of the most intense tactical pressure Zarthek had experienced since joining the coalition military. Long-range sensors showed the massive organism approaching their position with inexorable purpose. The transport pilot reported increasing organic interference with navigation systems. Every tactical instinct demanded immediate withdrawal. But something had changed in Zarthek's decision-making process. Instead of calculating acceptable losses and optimal resource utilization, he found himself thinking about the possibility that someone might be trapped in those lower levels. Someone like Private Kim or Michael Chen or Dr. Warren, not tactical assets but individuals whose survival mattered beyond strategic considerations. Void Stalkers established defensive positions around the transport, he commanded. We maintain extraction capability until search operations conclude. Torres's team returned with 90 seconds to spare, carrying 2 injured maintenance workers who had been trapped in a collapsed section of the lower levels. They were non-essential personnel by any tactical assessment, but as they were loaded aboard the transport, Zarthek observed the profound relief and satisfaction in the human soldiers' expressions. They had risked an entire operation for 2 maintenance workers. By coalition standards, the decision was tactically questionable at best, but as their transport cleared the station's destruction radius and the massive organism emerged from the facility's ruins, Zarthek realized something significant had occurred. The humans hadn't just completed a successful evacuation, they had demonstrated a form of strategic thinking that prioritized values over calculations, that treated individual life as intrinsically valuable rather than merely tactically useful. And somehow, this approach had produced superior results to standard coalition methods. During the return journey, Zarthek found himself in conversation with Dr. Warren about a team's research. She was studying devourer biomass adaptation patterns, trying to understand how the creatures modified their physical structure in response to different environmental challenges. The fascinating thing, she explained while reviewing data they had extracted from the station, is that devourers seem incapable of understanding certain types of behavior. They can analyze and adapt to logical, predictable patterns, but they struggle with what we might call irrational responses. Define irrational in this context, Zarthek requested. Actions that prioritize non-survival objectives, protecting others at personal cost. Continuing to fight after defeat becomes mathematically certain, making decisions based on emotional rather than logical factors. The Devourer's analytical systems seem unable to predict or counter such behavior. The observation aligned precisely with Captain Chen's earlier comments about using humanity as a tactical advantage. Are you suggesting that human irrationality represents a strategic asset? Doctor? Warren smiled, an expression that somehow conveyed both amusement and deep seriousness. Commander, what you call irrationality, we call humanity. And yes, it might be the most effective weapon we have against an enemy that thinks like a machine. The conversation continued for several hours, during which Zarthek gained new insight into human strategic thinking. They didn't simply fight to win battles or complete missions, they fought to preserve something they valued more than tactical success. Their willingness to take irrational risks, to prioritize individual welfare over operational efficiency, to make decisions based on emotional rather than logical factors, created patterns of behavior that sophisticated enemies couldn't predict or counter. As their transport approached the coalition fleet, Zarthek contemplated the implications of what he had learned. Human tactical doctrine appeared chaotic and inefficient by coalition standards, but it had consistently produced superior results in their recent engagements. Their approach to warfare incorporated variables that traditional military analysis ignored: loyalty, compassion, moral conviction, personal bonds, and somehow transformed those variables into tactical advantages. More troubling, he realized that working alongside humans was changing his own decision-making processes. Where he had once calculated optimal resource utilization, he now considered individual welfare. Where he had once prioritized mission completion, he now factored in broader questions about what made victory meaningful. The change disturbed him because it violated fundamental principles of effective military leadership, but it also excited him because it opened possibilities for achieving objectives that pure tactical efficiency could never accomplish. The humans had shown him that sometimes the most effective way to win was to fight for something more important than victory itself. As they docked with the Eternal Dominion, Captain Chen approached him one final time. "Commander, I want to thank you again for supporting our approach during the evacuation. I know it's different from coalition methods. Your methods achieved superior results," Zarthek acknowledged, "though I am still uncertain about their broader applications." Chen's expression suggested she understood his uncertainty. "Commander, can I ask you something personal? Before you worked with humans, did you ever question whether a mission was worth completing?" The question struck him as oddly phrased. Mission objectives are established by superior authority based on strategic necessity. Individual tactical commanders implement assigned parameters. That's not what I asked. Did you ever wonder whether achieving your objectives would actually make things better? Whether the people you were fighting for would be better off after you succeeded? Zarthek considered the question carefully. In his entire military career, he had never evaluated missions based on such criteria. Tactical success was measured by objective completion, casualty ratios, resource efficiency, and strategic contribution. Whether accomplishing those objectives served broader purposes beyond military necessity had never entered his calculations. "No," he admitted. "I have not considered such factors." "That's the difference between fighting and fighting for something," Chen said quietly. "We don't just want to defeat the Devourers. We want to build something worth defending afterward. And that changes everything about how we approach each battle." As he watched the human contingent disembark and prepare for their next assignment, Zarthek found himself contemplating Chen's words. For the first time in his military career, he began to wonder not just how to complete his missions, but whether completing them would actually create the kind of galaxy he wanted to live in. The war against the Devourers was far from over, and greater challenges lay ahead. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what they were fighting for. Victory alone was no longer sufficient. It had to be the right kind of victory, achieved in ways that preserved what made that victory meaningful. And for the first time in his life, he understood why humans were willing to risk everything for abstract concepts like honor, compassion, and hope. Those concepts weren't tactical liabilities. They were the very things that made survival worth achieving. The third time I watched humans face impossible odds, I learned the true meaning of fear. Not fear of death or defeat, but fear of becoming something I no longer recognized. Commander Zarthek stood before the tactical display in the war room of Coalition Command Station Nexus Prime, studying intelligence reports that painted an increasingly desperate picture. 3 weeks had passed since the successful evacuation of the research station, and the Devourers had responded with unprecedented aggression. 16 systems compromised in the last rotation. Admiral Theron's crystalline voice resonated through the chamber as he addressed the assembled Strategic Council. "The enemy's adaptation rate is accelerating beyond our projection models. They're not just learning our tactics, they're anticipating them." The holographic display showed a 3-dimensional map of local space, red indicators marking systems under Devourer control. The pattern was unmistakable, a steady advance toward the Coalition's core worlds, methodical and inexorable. But more troubling were the tactical analyses attached to each engagement report. "Here," Admiral Theron highlighted the Vega system, "Coalition forces deployed standard defensive formations. The Devourers countered with specialized organisms designed specifically to exploit those formations." And here, another system glowed. "They anticipated our retreat patterns and positioned interceptor forces accordingly." General Korash, the Krellian strategic advisor, spoke with the gravelly tones characteristic of his species. "The enemy is adapting faster than we can modify our tactics. If this trend continues, conventional military operations will become impossible within 6 standard months." Zarthek found his attention drawn not to the main display, but to a smaller tactical screen showing recent engagement recordings from human forces. Unlike coalition units, the human military formations appeared chaotic, almost random in their tactical approaches. Yet their success rates remained significantly higher than traditional coalition forces.
Admiral, he said, rising from his position, request permission to present alternative tactical observations.
Admiral Theron's 6 eyes focused on him with what might have been curiosity.
Proceed, Commander.
Zarthek activated his personal tactical display, showing comparative analysis between coalition and human engagement patterns.
Human forces demonstrate significantly better performance against adaptive enemy tactics. Their approach appears to be deliberately unpredictable. Explain, General Korash demanded, his massive form leaning forward with interest. Human tactical decisions frequently violate standard military doctrine, but they do so inconsistently. The enemy cannot establish pattern recognition because humans themselves don't follow consistent patterns. Zarthek paused, choosing his words carefully. They appear to make tactical decisions based on emotional factors rather than purely logical analysis. The statement generated immediate reaction from the assembled officers. Several species' vocalizations indicated skepticism or disapproval. Coalition military doctrine had spent centuries eliminating emotional decision-making from tactical planning, recognizing it as a source of error and inefficiency. Admiral Theron's harmonic tones carried diplomatic caution. Are you suggesting that coalition forces adopt irrational tactical approaches? Before Zarthek could respond, the chamber's communication system activated with an urgent priority signal. The holographic image that materialized showed Captain Chen aboard what appeared to be a heavily damaged human vessel, explosions visible in the background behind her. Coalition Command, this is Captain Chen, Terran Defense Corps. We have critical intelligence about Devourer adaptation patterns and immediate tactical recommendations. Admiral Theron activated the response system. Captain Chen, report your status and intelligence. My task force just concluded engagement with a previously unknown Devourer variant. These organisms demonstrated tactical adaptation capabilities far beyond previous encounters. They're not just learning our patterns, they're learning to learn faster.
The implications struck the assembled officers with varying degrees of alarm.
An enemy that could accelerate its own adaptation rate would eventually become impossible to defeat through conventional military means.
Elaborate on your tactical recommendations, General Korash requested. Captain Chen's expression reflected exhaustion, but her voice carried the focused intensity Zarthek had learned to associate with human strategic thinking under pressure.
We need to abandon predictable military operations entirely.
The more logical and efficient our tactics, the faster the enemy adapts to counter them. You're proposing deliberate tactical inefficiency? Admiral Theron's tone suggested confusion rather than disapproval. I'm proposing human tactics, Chen replied. Fight like people, not like military algorithms. Make decisions based on factors the enemy can't quantify or predict. Use loyalty, anger, fear, hope as strategic variables. The suggestion challenged fundamental assumptions about effective warfare, but Zarthek found himself thinking about his recent observations of human combat behavior. Their apparent tactical chaos had consistently produced superior results against Devourer forces. Captain, he interjected, you're suggesting coalition forces adopt emotional decision-making as standard operational procedure? Chen's expression shifted slightly, and he sensed she was evaluating how to explain concepts that might not translate effectively to coalition thinking. Commander, what you call emotional decision-making, we call human nature. And human nature is inherently unpredictable because it's based on values rather than calculations. General Korash's skepticism was evident in his posture. Values-based tactical decisions would seem to compromise operational effectiveness. General, with respect, operational effectiveness is exactly what we're achieving. My task force just destroyed a Devourer breeding cluster that 3 coalition battle groups couldn't eliminate. We did it by making tactical choices that no military computer would recommend. The claim was extraordinary, and Zarthek found himself intensely curious about the specific methodologies involved. Captain, could you provide tactical specifics about this engagement? What followed was a detailed briefing that challenged everything Zarthek thought he understood about effective military operations. Chen's task force had approached the Devourer cluster not with standard tactical doctrine, but with what she called human thinking applied to strategic planning. Instead of analyzing optimal attack vectors and resource utilization, they had considered the emotional and psychological factors that would make their attack unpredictable. They had deliberately chosen suboptimal positions because those positions reflected human emotional responses rather than logical tactical analysis. We attacked from the direction that would be most emotionally satisfying rather than most tactically sound, Chen explained. The Devourers had destroyed a civilian transport in that sector. My people wanted revenge, and revenge doesn't follow logical attack patterns. The approach seemed absurd, yet the results spoke for themselves. The Devourers' defensive organisms had been positioned to counter logical tactical approaches. When faced with attack patterns based on human emotional responses, they had been unable to adapt effectively. More remarkably, Chen's forces had not only destroyed the breeding cluster but had done so with minimal casualties. The emotional motivation that drove their tactical choices had somehow translated into enhanced combat effectiveness. The key insight, Chen continued, is that the Devourers analyze our behavior to predict our actions. But they're analyzing military behavior, not human behavior. When we fight as people rather than as soldiers, they can't understand or counter our tactics. Admiral Theron's crystalline features reflected deep consideration. You're proposing that coalition forces deliberately abandon optimal tactical approaches in favor of
Emotional responses. I'm proposing that we fight as a coalition of living beings rather than a military machine, Chen clarified.
Each species brings unique perspectives and motivations.
Instead of homogenizing our tactics, we should embrace those differences as tactical advantages. The concept was radical beyond anything in coalition military history. Standard doctrine emphasized coordinated operations based on proven tactical principles. The idea of deliberately introducing species-specific emotional factors seemed like a recipe for chaos and inefficiency. Yet, as Zarthek reviewed the engagement data, he realized that human forces had consistently outperformed coalition standards precisely because they refused to conform to those standards. Their success came not despite their emotional approach to warfare, but because of it. Admiral, he said, I request permission to conduct joint operations with Captain Chen's forces to evaluate these tactical approaches. The request surprised him even as he made it. Standard procedure would be to conduct thorough analysis and simulation before implementing new tactical doctrines. But something about Chen's approach resonated with his recent experiences fighting alongside human forces. Admiral Theron considered the request carefully. The strategic situation requires innovative approaches. Permission granted for joint tactical evaluation. You will have access to a mixed coalition human task force for field testing. As the briefing concluded and officers began filing out of the chamber, Captain Chen approached Zarthek directly.
Her expression carried an intensity he had learned to recognize as precursor to important communications.
Commander, I need to be completely honest with you about what we're proposing.
Fighting as humans rather than soldiers isn't just a tactical adjustment. It's a fundamental change in how you think about warfare itself. Explain, he requested, genuinely interested in understanding the implications. When coalition forces engage the enemy, they're trying to complete mission objectives efficiently and with minimal casualties. When humans engage the enemy, we're trying to protect everything we care about. That difference changes every tactical decision you make. The distinction seemed subtle but profound. Zarthek had never considered that there might be meaningful differences between completing missions and protecting values. Both approaches aimed for victory against enemy forces. What practical differences would this produce in combat situations, he asked. Chen's response would prove prophetic in ways neither of them anticipated. Commander, when you're fighting to complete objectives, you make decisions based on tactical optimization. When you're fighting to protect what matters to you, you make decisions based on what you're not willing to lose. And sometimes, what you're not willing to lose isn't tactically optimal to protect. 3 days later, Zarthek found himself commanding a mixed task force approaching the Proxima Centauri system, where Devourer forces had established a major processing facility. The operation would serve as a practical test of human tactical approaches applied to coalition military operations. His command included his original Voidstalker unit, now veterans of multiple engagements alongside human forces, plus additional coalition elements from 3 different species. The human contingent was led by Captain Chen herself, with her core team supplemented by specialists from other human military units. But the most significant change was in the composition of his strategic planning team. Instead of relying purely on tactical analysis computers and military doctrine, he now included human advisors whose role was to provide what Chen called human perspective on strategic decisions. The briefing session reflected this new approach. Traditional tactical analysis identified optimal attack vectors, resource allocation, and engagement timelines. But now they also considered factors that had never appeared in coalition military planning. The Devourers have been processing civilians from the Proxima colonies for 3 weeks, reported Lieutenant Torres. From a human emotional perspective, that creates a strong revenge motivation that would drive aggressive, high-risk tactical choices. Tactical advisor Kexval, one of Zarthek's senior officers, expressed the confusion this approach generated in traditional coalition thinking. How does emotional motivation translate into tactical advantage? Captain Chen's response illuminated the fundamental difference in human strategic thinking. Because emotional motivation makes us willing to attempt tactics that military doctrine would consider too risky. And those risky tactics are exactly what the Devourers can't predict or counter. The specific plan they developed would have been rejected by any coalition strategic computer as unnecessarily dangerous and tactically unsound. Instead of approaching the processing facility through optimal attack vectors, they chose an approach that reflected human emotional responses to the situation. The facility was surrounded by defensive organisms, positioned to counter logical military approaches. But humans driven by anger at civilian casualties wouldn't choose logical approaches. They would attack from whatever direction would allow them to inflict maximum damage on the enemy, regardless of tactical efficiency. "We're going to attack through the asteroid field," Chen announced, indicating a region of space that tactical doctrine would classify as unsuitable for military operations. It's dangerous, unpredictable, and offers no tactical advantages. Which is exactly why the Devourers won't expect it. Zarthek found himself experiencing something entirely new in his military career, making tactical decisions that contradicted his training while simultaneously feeling confident they were correct. The asteroid field approach was objectively dangerous, but it reflected the kind of choice humans would make when motivated by rage and determination, rather than tactical optimization. More significantly, as they approached the target system, he realized he was no longer thinking about this mission in terms of objective completion and resource efficiency. Instead, he was thinking about the 47,000 civilians whose lives had been consumed to create the processing facility. About preventing similar atrocities. About sending a message to the enemy that such actions carried consequences beyond tactical considerations. The emotional shift was profound and disturbing. Effective military leadership required objective decision-making based on strategic necessity. Personal feelings about enemy actions were irrelevant to tactical effectiveness. Yet somehow, allowing those feelings to influence his planning seemed to be producing superior tactical results. The attack itself demonstrated the practical applications of human tactical thinking applied to coalition military capabilities. The asteroid field approach required constant real-time adaptation to changing conditions. Exactly the kind of improvised response that Devourer analytical systems struggled to predict. Zarthek's Voidstalkers, with their superior reflexes and integrated weapon systems, excelled in the chaotic environment. But what surprised him was how effectively they worked alongside human forces whose different capabilities complemented their own in ways standard tactical doctrine couldn't anticipate. When Sergeant Santos's unit became separated in the asteroid field and faced overwhelming Devourer interceptor forces, the response demonstrated the new tactical principles in action. Standard coalition protocol would have evaluated the tactical situation and determined optimal resource allocation for rescue operations. Instead, Zarthek found himself immediately redirecting 3 Voidstalker squadrons to Santos's position, not because tactical analysis indicated this was the most efficient use of resources, but because the idea of abandoning those specific people was unacceptable to him personally. The rescue operation required them to fight through asteroid-dense space against numerically superior enemy forces, using tactics that were simultaneously reckless and highly effective. They succeeded not because their approach was tactically optimal, but because their emotional investment in the outcome drove them to achieve objectives that pure calculation would have deemed impossible. As they penetrated the processing facility's defenses, Zarthek witnessed something that fundamentally altered his understanding of what they were fighting against. The Devourer facility wasn't just a military target, it was a monument to the systematic elimination of everything that made life meaningful. The processed remains of Proxima's civilian population had been converted into biological machinery, their individual identities consumed to create organic computers that served the enemy's strategic planning. What had once been people with names, families, hopes and dreams was now anonymous biomass serving alien purposes. The sight triggered reactions in his mixed task force that purely tactical training couldn't have prepared them for. Coalition forces experienced what their psychological profiles would classify as excessive emotional response to battlefield conditions. Human forces experienced what they simply called rage, but instead of compromising their tactical effectiveness, these emotional responses seemed to enhance their combat capabilities. They fought with an intensity and focus that exceeded standard performance parameters, driven by motivations that transcended military objectives. The facility's defensive organisms were configured to counter logical military approaches, but they faced attackers whose tactical decisions were based on moral outrage rather than strategic analysis. The resulting battle was chaotic, violent, and utterly unpredictable, exactly the combination of factors that neutralized Devourer adaptive capabilities. During the facility's destruction, Zarthek experienced what he would later recognize as the moment his transformation from Coalition commander to something else became irreversible. As they fought through corridors lined with the processed remains of sentient beings, he stopped thinking about mission objectives and resource optimization. Instead, he found himself driven by something he had never experienced before, the absolute determination to ensure that this specific atrocity would be completely eliminated, that every trace of the facility would be destroyed, that the enemy would understand there were consequences for treating sentient life as mere biological material. The feeling was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it provided focus and motivation beyond anything tactical training had offered. Terrifying because it represented a fundamental change in his identity as a military officer. When Captain Chen found him standing among the ruins of the facility's central processing chamber, where thousands of individual identities had been consumed and converted into enemy resources, she seemed to understand exactly what he was experiencing.
It changes you, she said simply.
Seeing what they do to people. Understanding that every tactical decision you make is really about preventing this from happening to someone else. Zartek looked around the chamber, trying to process the implications of what they had discovered and destroyed. I find myself angry, he admitted, not tactically concerned about enemy capabilities. Angry about what was done here. Good, Chen replied. Anger means you understand what we're really fighting for, and that understanding makes us more dangerous than any weapon system ever could. As their task force completed the facility's destruction and prepared for withdrawal, Zarthek realized that Captain Chen had been correct about the fundamental nature of fighting as humans rather than soldiers.
The tactical changes were significant, but the psychological changes were far more profound. He was no longer the same commander who had grudgingly accepted human integration into his unit.
The systematic exposure to human approaches to warfare had altered his basic understanding of what military operations were supposed to achieve. Victory was no longer sufficient. It had to be the right kind of victory, accomplished in ways that preserved rather than compromised the values that made victory meaningful. During the return journey to Coalition space, he found himself in conversation with his senior staff about their experiences during the operation. What he discovered was that the changes he was experiencing were not unique to him. Lieutenant Kexvol, his most traditional officer, admitted to making tactical decisions based on factors that had no place in Coalition military doctrine. When those civilians were processed into biological machinery, he said, I found myself wanting to ensure that every piece of that facility was destroyed, regardless of strategic value.
Similar conversations with other Coalition personnel revealed that exposure to human tactical approaches had created systematic changes in their decision-making processes. They were no longer thinking purely in terms of military efficiency, but were beginning to consider broader questions about what their military actions were supposed to accomplish.
The transformation was not without costs. Several officers reported difficulty reconciling their new approach with traditional Coalition doctrine. The emotional investment that enhanced their combat effectiveness also created psychological stress that standard military training hadn't prepared them to handle, but the benefits were undeniable. Their mixed Coalition human task force had achieved tactical objectives that pure Coalition forces had been unable to accomplish. More importantly, they had done so in ways that preserved their commitment to the values they were fighting to protect. As they approached Coalition Command Station Nexus Prime, Captain Chen joined Zarthek in the observation lounge to discuss the implications of their successful operation. Commander, I need to warn you about something, she said, her expression reflecting serious concern. Once you start fighting as a human rather than just as a soldier, you can't go back. The change is permanent. Zarthek considered her warning carefully. In the weeks since he had begun working alongside human forces, he had experienced fundamental alterations in his approach to military operations, his relationships with subordinates, and his understanding of what effective leadership required. Those changes had consistently produced superior results, but they had also created psychological complexity that his original training hadn't anticipated. He was no longer certain whether he was becoming a better military officer or was being transformed into something the Coalition doctrine might not recognize as a proper military officer at all. Captain, he said finally, I'm not certain the distinction between human and soldier is as clear as you suggest. Perhaps effective military leadership has always required the qualities you call human nature. Chen's smile suggested she had hoped you would reach that conclusion. Commander, that's exactly what we've been trying to tell the galaxy. The things that make us human. Compassion, loyalty, moral conviction, willingness to sacrifice for others, aren't weaknesses to be overcome. They're strategic advantages that make us more effective at everything we do, including warfare. As their ships docked with the station and prepared to report on their mission's success, Zarthek found himself contemplating the broader implications of what they had discovered. If human tactical approaches could be successfully integrated with coalition military capabilities, it might represent more than just improved combat effectiveness. It might represent a fundamental evolution in how the galaxy's civilizations approach the challenge of defending themselves against existential threats. Not just as military organizations pursuing tactical objectives, but as communities of living beings fighting to preserve everything that made their existence meaningful. The war against the Devourers was far from over, and the enemy's adaptive capabilities ensured that future challenges would be even greater than what they had already faced. But for the first time since the conflict began, Zarthek felt confident they had found an approach that could not only achieve victory, but could do so in ways that preserved what made victory worth achieving. The fear he had learned from fighting beside humans wasn't fear of death or defeat, it was fear of becoming so focused on tactical efficiency that he forgot what he was fighting for. And that fear, he realized, might be the most valuable lesson humanity could teach the galaxy. The fourth time I saw humans refuse to surrender, I understood why the galaxy had underestimated them for so long. We had been measuring their strength by our own standards, never realizing that their greatest weapon was something we couldn't quantify. The emergency session at Coalition Command was unlike any military briefing Commander Zarthak had ever witnessed. Representatives from 17 different species filled the grand amphitheater, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of clicks, harmonic tones, and electromagnetic pulses that the universal translators struggled to process simultaneously. Admiral Theron's crystalline form dominated the central platform, but even his commanding presence seemed diminished by the gravity of the intelligence reports he was presenting. The holographic display behind him showed a tactical nightmare that challenged everything the Coalition thought they knew about the war. Confirmed intelligence from the Tau Ceti system indicates that Devourer forces have achieved exponential adaptation breakthrough, Admiral Theron announced, his harmonic tones carrying frequencies that registered distress across multiple species. They are no longer simply learning our tactics, they are predicting our tactical evolution. The implications struck the assembled officers like a physical blow. An enemy that could predict how their opponents would adapt to new situations could theoretically stay ahead of any military countermeasures indefinitely. General Korash, his massive Krellian frame emanating frustration through subsonic vibrations, provided additional context. 3 coalition battle groups engaged Devourer forces in the Tau Ceti system using our latest tactical modifications. The enemy was prepared for tactics we had developed but not yet implemented in combat. Zarthek felt his internal systems process this information with growing alarm. Since beginning joint operations with human forces, coalition tactical effectiveness had improved dramatically. But if the enemy could anticipate tactical innovation itself, all military operations might become futile. "Sir," he said, rising from his position, "what about human tactical approaches? Had the Devourers demonstrated prediction capabilities against irregular warfare patterns?" Admiral Theron's response carried undertones that suggested both hope and concern.
Interesting observation, Commander.
Human forces in the same engagements achieve significantly better results. However, analysis indicates the Devourers are beginning to develop countermeasures for human tactical unpredictability as well. The chamber fell silent as the full implications became clear. If the enemy could learn to predict even human emotional decision-making patterns, the Coalition's last tactical advantage would be eliminated. Captain Chen's voice cut through the silence as her holographic image appeared in the center of the amphitheater. She was transmitting from the bridge of a human vessel that appeared to be in the middle of combat operations, energy discharges visible through the viewports behind her. "Coalition Command, this is Captain Chen reporting from the Sol Defense Perimeter. We have critical intelligence about Devourer adaptation capabilities and an immediate strategic recommendation." Admiral Theron activated the communications interface. "Captain Chen, report your status and intelligence."
"Admiral, Devourer forces have launched a massive assault on the Sol system."
Initial analysis suggests they're using tactical countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize human unpredictability patterns. Chen paused as another explosion illuminated the bridge behind her. "But we've discovered something that changes everything about how we need to approach this war." The tension in the amphitheater was palpable as representatives from multiple species waited for information that might determine the outcome of their civilization's survival. "Proceed, Captain," Admiral Theron commanded. Chen's expression reflected exhaustion, but her voice carried absolute conviction. "The Devourers aren't just adapting to our military tactics. They're trying to understand why we fight. Their analysis systems are attempting to quantify human motivational factors to predict our tactical choices." General Korash's subsonic rumble indicated confusion. "Elaborate on the strategic implications." "General, they can predict tactical patterns, but they can't understand why humans make the choices we make. They're analyzing our behavior like we're sophisticated biological machines, but we're not machines. We're people, and people fight for reasons that can't be quantified." The observation struck Zarthek with sudden clarity. Throughout their joint operations, he had noticed that human tactical decisions often seemed to contradict their own best interests from a purely survival perspective. They took risks to protect others, continued fighting after logic suggested retreat, and made sacrifices that served no tactical purpose. Those seemingly irrational choices had consistently produced superior battlefield results, precisely because they were incomprehensible to an enemy that analyzed behavior through purely logical frameworks. "Captain," Admiral Theron interjected, "you're suggesting that human irrationality remains an effective countermeasure against Devourer adaptation." Chen's response would fundamentally alter Zarthek's understanding of what humanity brought to the Coalition. "Admiral, with respect, what you call irrationality is actually the most rational response possible to our situation. We're not fighting to optimize tactical outcomes. We're fighting to preserve everything that makes existence meaningful."
She gestured to something outside the holographic transmission's field of view.
"The Sol system contains 8 billion human lives. Our entire civilization's history, everything we've ever created or dreamed of becoming. When Devourers threaten that, we don't calculate optimal response strategies. We respond with everything we have, in ways that make sense to us as human beings, regardless of what military computers recommend." The transmission flickered as another massive energy discharge illuminated Chen's bridge. When the image stabilized, her expression had hardened with determination that Zarthek recognized from their previous combat operations. "Coalition Command, I'm requesting immediate deployment of all available forces to Sol system defense. Not because tactical analysis indicates we can achieve victory, but because this is where we make our stand. If we lose Sol, we lose everything that makes winning worthwhile." Admiral Theron's crystalline features reflected deep consideration. "Captain, strategic analysis suggests that committing major coalition forces to Sol system defense could compromise our ability to protect other core worlds if the operation fails." "Admiral," Chen replied, "if we lose Sol, protecting other worlds becomes meaningless. Earth isn't just another strategic target. It's the symbol of everything we're fighting for. More importantly, defending it will demonstrate something to the Devourers that their analysis systems can't comprehend, which is that there are things worth fighting for that transcend tactical calculations. And when you fight for those things, you become capable of achieving objectives that no computer can predict." The transmission ended, leaving the amphitheater in contemplative silence. Zarthek found himself processing Chen's words alongside his own experiences fighting alongside human forces. Their approach to warfare had consistently produced results that exceeded tactical projections, but he was beginning to understand that their effectiveness came from factors that traditional military analysis couldn't measure. Admiral Theron addressed the assembled officers. "Strategic recommendations regarding Captain Chen's request?" What followed was a debate that revealed fundamental differences in how various species approached the concept of warfare. Coalition doctrine emphasized resource preservation, optimal tactical distribution, and strategic flexibility. Committing major forces to defend a single system, regardless of its symbolic value, contradicted basic military principles. But Zarthek found himself thinking not about tactical optimization, but about the implications of abandoning the people he had fought beside, learned from, and come to respect as fellow warriors. The idea of allowing Sol System to fall while preserving coalition forces for other battles felt like a betrayal of everything he had learned about effective military leadership. "Admiral," he said, rising to address the assembly, "I recommend full coalition support for Sol System defense." The statement generated immediate reaction from multiple species representatives, ranging from approval to shock to outright dismay. General Korash's subsonic emanations indicated strong disapproval. "Commander Zarthek, your recommendation contradicts basic strategic doctrine. Concentrating forces to defend a single system could compromise our ability to protect multiple strategic targets." Zarthek had anticipated this objection, but his response reflected thinking that his original military training wouldn't have supported. General, I believe our strategic doctrine may be incomplete. Human tactical approaches have consistently produced superior results because they incorporate factors that traditional analysis doesn't consider. Such as, Admiral Theron inquired, the psychological impact of demonstrating absolute commitment to protecting what we value most. If coalition forces abandon Sol system to preserve tactical flexibility, we're sending a message to both our allies and our enemies that our strategic calculations are more important than our relationships with the people we're fighting alongside. The observation opened a discussion about concepts that had rarely appeared in coalition military planning. What message did their tactical choices send to their allies? How did symbolic victories or defeats affect overall strategic momentum? Were there situations where tactical sub-optimization might produce strategic advantages? Over the next several hours, Zarthek found himself articulating ideas that challenged his own previous understanding of effective military leadership. Working alongside human forces had exposed him to approaches to warfare that prioritized values over calculations, that treated individual relationships as strategically significant, that recognized moral conviction as a legitimate tactical variable. The humans fight differently because they understand something we've overlooked, he explained to the assembly. Military effectiveness isn't just about optimal resource utilization. It's about creating the kind of relationships and commitments that make people willing to achieve impossible objectives. The debate continued through multiple sessions as coalition leadership grappled with concepts that their standard strategic planning couldn't easily accommodate. But gradually, consensus emerged around a realization that Zartek's experience fighting alongside humans had made obvious to him weeks earlier. Their current approach wasn't working. Despite superior technology, resources, and numerical advantages, coalition forces were steadily losing ground to an enemy that could adapt faster than they could innovate. The only tactical approach that had shown consistent success was the human method of fighting, for reasons that transcended tactical optimization. 2 days later, Zarthek found himself aboard the coalition flagship Eternal Dominion as part of the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, heading towards Sol System for what would likely be the decisive battle of the war against the Devourers. The fleet composition reflected the coalition's commitment to supporting human tactical approaches. Instead of the usual segregation by species capabilities, the task force was organized as integrated battle groups combining different species' strengths under unified command structures that incorporated human strategic thinking.
More significantly, the mission parameters had been modified to reflect human concepts of warfare.
Instead of objectives focused purely on tactical outcomes, the operation included goals related to preserving civilian populations, maintaining morale among allied forces, and demonstrating coalition commitment to protecting member species regardless of strategic cost. As they transitioned from hyperspace at the edge of Sol System, the magnitude of the challenge became immediately apparent. Devourer forces had established a massive siege formation around Earth, their organic vessels forming layers of defensive screens that extended from lunar orbit to beyond Mars. But what struck Zarthek most powerfully wasn't the size of the enemy fleet, but the sight of human defensive formations. Despite being outnumbered by factors that should have made resistance futile, human forces continued to engage the enemy with undiminished intensity. Tactical analysis indicates human casualties exceed 60%, reported Lieutenant Kexval, yet their combat effectiveness remains at near optimal levels.
The observation reflected something Zarthek had learned about human psychology during their joint operations. Other species fought most effectively when survival seemed probable.
Humans fought most effectively when something they valued was threatened, regardless of survival probability. Captain Chen's voice crackled across the communication system as the Coalition fleet approached battle range. Coalition forces, this is Sol Defense Command. We are honored to have you fight beside us in defense of our home. Admiral Theron's response reflected the Coalition's commitment to the new tactical approach. Captain Chen, Coalition forces are honored to stand with humanity in defense of what matters most to you. The exchange might have seemed like mere diplomatic courtesy, but Zarthek recognized it as something more significant. It represented acknowledgement that this battle wasn't just about tactical objectives or strategic outcomes. It was about relationships, about the kind of galaxy they wanted to create, about values that made victory meaningful. The battle that followed would be remembered as the moment when the Coalition truly understood what humanity brought to their alliance. The initial engagement demonstrated the Devourers' advanced adaptation capabilities. Their formations countered standard Coalition tactics with precision that suggested complete understanding of traditional military approaches.
Conventional battle groups found themselves neutralized by enemy countermeasures that anticipated their responses with uncanny accuracy. But as mixed coalition human units engaged the enemy using human tactical approaches, the dynamic shifted dramatically. Devourer forces that had been prepared for logical military responses found themselves facing attack patterns that defied analytical prediction. Zarthek commanded one of these mixed units, and his experience during the battle revealed the practical applications of everything he had learned about fighting alongside humans. When tactical analysis suggested retreat to preserve resources, human crew members advocated for continued engagement to protect civilian evacuation routes. When optimal targeting indicated focusing on high-value military assets, human tactical thinking prioritized threats to non-combatant populations. These decisions contradicted his military training, but they consistently produced superior battlefield results. More importantly, they created psychological effects that tactical computers couldn't predict, but human experience understood instinctively.
"Commander," called Sergeant Santos from her position at the tactical control station. "Enemy formations are adapting to our attack patterns, but they're adapting in the wrong direction." Zarthek studied the tactical displays with growing amazement. Devourer forces were modifying their defensive strategies based on logical military analysis of coalition attacks. But because the coalition attacks were based on human emotional and moral considerations rather than pure tactical logic, the enemy's adaptations were actually making them more vulnerable.
"They're predicting what we should do based on military efficiency," Santos continued. "But we're doing what we need to do based on what matters to us. Their countermeasures are designed for the wrong kind of enemy."
The insight illuminated something profound about the nature of their conflict. The Devourers possessed sophisticated analytical capabilities that allowed them to understand and counter logical tactical approaches.
But they were fundamentally incapable of understanding motivations that transcended survival and efficiency. When human forces risked everything to protect civilian evacuation ships, the enemy couldn't comprehend why military units would prioritize non-combatant safety over tactical advantage.
When coalition officers made decisions based on loyalty to their human allies rather than optimal resource utilization, Devourer analysis systems failed to predict their actions accurately. The battle raged for 18 hours, during which Zarthek witnessed demonstrations of human nature that forever altered his understanding of what made effective military leadership. Time and again he saw human personnel make choices that tactical doctrine would classify as errors, yet those choices consistently produced tactical advantages that no computer could have calculated. Private Rodriguez, operating a defensive battery that had sustained severe damage, continued fighting despite injuries that should have required evacuation. When questioned about his decision to remain at his post, his response epitomized human tactical thinking. "My friends are depending on this battery. I can't let them down." The statement would have made no sense to Devourer analytical systems, which evaluated personnel decisions based on survival probability and resource optimization. But Rodriguez's determination to protect his comrades translated directly into enhanced defensive effectiveness that contributed measurably to their sector's successful defense. Similar examples occurred throughout the battle as human personnel made decisions based on personal relationships, moral commitments, and emotional bonds that had no place in traditional military analysis. Yet those decisions consistently enhanced rather than compromised their tactical effectiveness. More remarkably, Zarthek observed his own coalition personnel beginning to adopt similar decision-making patterns. Lieutenant Kixval, his most traditionally minded officer, refused evacuation from a damaged command station because the human crew members are staying, and it would be inappropriate for coalition officers to abandon their posts while allies remain. The choice reflected thinking that Zartek's original training would have classified as emotional contamination of professional judgment. But Kekcheval's decision to remain at his post provided critical command coordination that proved essential to their sector's defensive success. As the battle approached its climax, with Devourer forces making a final massive assault on Earth's orbital defenses, Zarthek found himself facing a command decision that would define not just the battle's outcome, but his own understanding of what effective leadership required. Tactical analysis indicated that coalition forces could achieve strategic victory by withdrawing to defensive positions around Mars and allowing Devourer forces to exhaust themselves against Earth's fixed defenses. The approach would minimize coalition casualties while maximizing enemy losses, representing optimal tactical utilization of available resources. But it would also mean abandoning Earth's civilian population to direct enemy assault during the critical final phase of the battle. Millions of non-combatants would die while coalition forces preserved themselves for strategic advantage. The decision should have been straightforward, based on military doctrine. Strategic victory required optimal resource preservation and tactical efficiency. Individual casualties, however regrettable, were acceptable if they contributed to overall mission success. Yet as Zarthi contemplated giving the withdrawal order, he found himself thinking not about tactical optimization, but about the people he had fought beside, learned from, and come to consider as genuine allies rather than merely useful military assets. He thought about Captain Chen's commitment to never leaving anyone behind, about Sergeant Santos fighting to avenge her lost colony, about Private Rodriguez staying at his post to protect his friends. He thought about human tactical approaches that prioritized relationships over calculations, that treated individual lives as intrinsically valuable rather than merely tactically useful. And he realized that if he ordered coalition forces to withdraw and preserve themselves while Earth's population faced annihilation, he would be violating everything he had learned about what made military victory meaningful. All coalition units, he commanded, advance to close support positions around Earth orbital defense platforms. We do not retreat while allies are under direct assault. The order contradicted tactical doctrine and risked significant coalition casualties for no quantifiable strategic advantage. But it reflected the kind of decision-making he had learned from fighting alongside humans, choices based on values rather than calculations, on relationships rather than resource optimization. The response from coalition forces was immediate and unanimous. Instead of the reluctant compliance he expected, his units advanced toward Earth with an enthusiasm and determination that exceeded their performance parameters. They weren't just following orders, they were fighting for something that mattered to them personally. The final phase of the battle demonstrated the ultimate effectiveness of human tactical approaches applied to coalition military capabilities. Fighting not just to complete mission objectives, but to protect people they cared about, coalition forces achieved tactical results that their own computers classified as impossible. Devourer forces, configured to counter logical military responses, found themselves facing attack patterns that defied analytical prediction. When faced with defenders whose tactical choices were based on moral conviction rather than strategic optimization, enemy adaptation capabilities became irrelevant. The Devourers could predict efficient tactical responses, but they couldn't understand why someone would risk everything to protect others. They could calculate optimal resource utilization, but they couldn't comprehend decisions based on friendship, loyalty, or love. As the last major Devourer formation was destroyed and enemy forces began retreating from Sol System, Zarthek found himself experiencing emotions he had never associated with military victory. Relief certainly, and satisfaction at successful mission completion. But also something deeper, a sense of having participated in something meaningful beyond tactical accomplishment. They hadn't just defeated the enemy, they had demonstrated that there were values worth fighting for that transcended survival itself. They had shown that military effectiveness came not just from superior technology or tactics, but from the kinds of relationships and commitments that made people willing to achieve impossible objectives. In the aftermath of the battle, as coalition and human forces worked together to secure Sol System and care for casualties, Zarthek realized that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of what military service meant. He was no longer just a coalition officer following orders and completing missions. He was someone who had chosen to stand beside others in defense of values they all shared. Someone who had learned that the most effective way to fight was not to optimize tactical outcomes, but to protect what made victory worth achieving. Captain Chen found him in the observation lounge of the Eternal Dominion, watching Earth slowly rotate below them as reconstruction efforts began across the planet's surface. "Commander," she said, settling into a chair beside him, "I want to thank you for what you did during the battle. Keeping coalition forces engaged when tactical doctrine recommended withdrawal. That saved millions of lives." Zarthek considered her words carefully. "Captain, I made that decision not because tactical analysis recommended it, but because abandoning Earth would have been wrong. Not tactically incorrect, morally wrong." Chen's smile reflected the warmth he had learned to associate with human satisfaction at successful outcomes. "Commander, that's exactly the kind of thinking that makes humans and coalition forces so effective together. We don't just calculate what we can accomplish, we consider what we should accomplish." As they watched shuttles ferrying supplies and medical assistance between coalition vessels and Earth's surface, Zarthek found himself contemplating the broader implications of what they had achieved. The battle for Sol System had been more than just a military victory. It had been proof that different species could work together effectively when they shared common values and mutual respect. "Captain," he said, "I believe this battle has changed something fundamental about how coalition forces will approach future military operations." "How so?"
We've learned that fighting for something you believe in makes you more effective than fighting just to complete missions. That lesson will change how we train, how we plan operations, how we think about what military service means.
Chen's expression suggested she had hoped he would reach that conclusion. Commander, that's the most important victory we could have achieved. Not just defeating the Devourers, but demonstrating that the galaxy's civilizations can work together as allies rather than just as military partners. As their conversation continued, Zarthek realized that the war against the Devourers, while far from over, had already accomplished something that might be more significant than tactical victory. It had created genuine partnerships between species that had previously been separated by differences in culture, physiology, and strategic thinking. Those partnerships, based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than mere military necessity, would prove to be humanity's greatest contribution to the galaxy. They had shown that strength came not just from superior weapons or tactics, but from the bonds formed between those who choose to stand together in defense of what they believe is worth protecting. The fear Zarthek had learned from fighting beside humans, the fear of losing sight of what made victory meaningful, had become the foundation for something greater than he had ever imagined possible.
It had become the basis for a new kind of civilization, one where different species could work together, not just to survive, but to build something worth surviving for. The fifth time I stood beside humans in battle, I finally understood what they had been trying to teach the galaxy. All along, it wasn't about how to fight better. It was about how to live better. And in teaching us that, they gave us something more powerful than any weapon: hope for what we could become together.
3 months after the victory at Sol System, Commander Zarthek stood in what had once been the central command chamber of a Devourer megastructure, watching Coalition and human engineering teams work together to convert the massive organic facility into something unprecedented in galactic history, a joint research station dedicated to understanding and healing the damage caused by the war. The transformation was both symbolic and practical, where the Devourers had created a facility for consuming and converting sentient life into biological machinery. The Coalition was building something designed to preserve and enhance life across multiple species. But, more significantly, the project represented a fundamental change in how different civilizations approached cooperation and shared challenges. Status report, Zarthek requested as Captain Chen approached through the construction zone, her environmental suit marked with the insignia of the new Interspecies Cooperation Initiative. Engineering is ahead of schedule, Chen replied, removing her helmet to reveal the satisfaction that had become her characteristic expression when discussing collaborative projects. The Zaraki crystalline matrix technology integrates perfectly with human atmospheric processes, and your people's organic interface systems are allowing us to reprogram the original biomachinery for constructive purposes instead of destructive ones. The technical achievement was impressive, but Zarthek had learned to appreciate the deeper significance of such accomplishments. The project wasn't just about converting enemy infrastructure. It was about demonstrating that different species could combine their unique capabilities to create something greater than any of them could achieve alone. More importantly, Chen continued, the psychological impact on both our personnel and the local populations has exceeded all projections. People are starting to see the war not just as a fight for survival, but as an opportunity to build something better than what existed before the conflict began. The observation reflected one of the most profound lessons Zarthek had learned from working alongside humans. Their approach to warfare wasn't just about defeating enemies. It was about creating the kind of future that made victory meaningful. Even in the midst of existential conflict, they maintained focus on post-war reconstruction, relationship building, and collaborative problem-solving. As they walked through the facility, Zarthek observed the kind of interspecies cooperation that would have been impossible under traditional Coalition protocols. Human technicians worked seamlessly alongside Voidstalker engineers, their different physical capabilities and cognitive approaches complementing each other in ways that enhanced everyone's effectiveness. But what struck him most powerfully was the atmosphere of genuine camaraderie that had developed between species that had previously maintained careful professional distance. The barriers that had once separated Coalition members weren't just being bridged, they were being dissolved entirely.
Commander, called Dr. Warren, the human researcher who had been part of their early evacuation missions. I want to show you something remarkable we've discovered. She led them to a section of the facility where teams were analyzing the remains of Devourer biocomputing systems. The organic machinery that had once processed the thoughts and memories of consumed civilizations was being carefully studied to understand how the enemy had achieved their analytical capabilities. What we're finding, Dr. Basil, Warren explained, is that the Devourer's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. Their analytical systems were incredibly sophisticated at understanding logical, predictable behavior patterns, but they were completely blind to the kinds of motivational factors that drive human decision-making. She activated a holographic display showing comparative analysis between devourer, tactical predictions, and actual human tactical choices during recent battles. The discrepancy was remarkable. Enemy projections consistently underestimated human effectiveness by factors that indicated fundamental misunderstanding rather than simple calculation errors. They could predict what we should do based on optimization principles. Dr. Warren continued. But they couldn't predict what we would do based on what matters to us emotionally and morally. And that difference was what allowed us to defeat an enemy that was superior to us in every measurable category. Lieutenant Torres, who had been observing the analysis, offered additional insight that illuminated the broader implications of their discovery. It's not just that they couldn't understand human nature. They couldn't understand why any species would prioritize relationships and values over survival and efficiency. The statement struck Zartek with sudden clarity about something that had puzzled him throughout the war. Coalition forces possessed superior technology, greater numbers, and more extensive military experience than humanity. Yet human tactical approaches had consistently produced better results against devourer forces. The reason wasn't that humans were better warriors. It was that they fought for different reasons. Dr. Warren, he said, are you suggesting that the key to defeating the devourers wasn't developing better weapons or tactics, but maintaining the kinds of values and relationships that made victory worthwhile? Exactly, she confirmed. The devourers represented the logical endpoint of pure analytical thinking applied to survival and resource optimization. They were incredibly effective at achieving their objectives, but they had no concept of why those objectives might be worth achieving. Captain Chen added perspective that reflected her experience commanding mixed-species units throughout the conflict. What we learned fighting alongside coalition forces is that every species brings unique strengths, but those strengths become exponentially more effective when they're applied in service of shared values rather than just tactical objectives.
The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from Admiral Farron aboard the Coalition flagship.
His crystalline features reflected excitement rather than the stress that had characterized most military communications during the war. Commander Zarthak, Captain Chen, I have extraordinary news. Long-range reconnaissance has confirmed the complete withdrawal of devourer forces from all contested systems. Intelligence analysis suggests they have retreated beyond the galactic rim and are showing no signs of renewed offensive operations. The announcement should have generated celebration, but Zarthak found himself experiencing a complex mixture of relief and uncertainty. Military victory had been achieved, but the greater challenge of determining what to do with that victory remained. Admiral, he said, what are Coalition's strategic plans for the post-war period? Admiral Theron's response revealed thinking that had been fundamentally altered by the experience of working alongside human forces.
Commander, that's precisely what we need to discuss.
Traditional Coalition protocol would focus on territorial reorganization, resource allocation, and defensive preparations for potential future conflicts. But recent experiences suggest we should consider broader objectives. Captain Chen's expression indicated she understood exactly what Admiral Theron was contemplating. Admiral, are you suggesting that the Coalition adopt long-term goals that go beyond military security and tactical efficiency? Captain, I'm suggesting that the war has demonstrated the effectiveness of approaches to interspecies cooperation that Coalition doctrine never anticipated. The question now is whether we can apply those approaches to building the kind of galactic civilization that prevents future conflicts rather than simply preparing to fight them. The conversation that followed represented a fundamental shift in how galactic civilizations thought about their relationships with each other. Instead of focusing on maintaining separate spheres of influence with carefully negotiated interaction protocols, they began discussing genuine integration based on shared values and mutual respect. Over the following weeks, as devourer withdrawal was confirmed across multiple systems and the immediate military threat diminished, Zarthak found himself involved in discussions that would have been impossible under traditional coalition governance structures. Representatives from dozens of species gathered not to negotiate territorial boundaries or trade agreements, but to explore what kind of galaxy they wanted to build together. The conversations revealed that the war had changed more than just military tactics. It had created genuine relationships between species that had previously known each other only through formal diplomatic channels. The humans had served as catalysts for this transformation, but the changes extended far beyond human influence. Species that had maintained professional distance for centuries were discovering that they could work together effectively when they shared common purposes and mutual respect.
The key insight Captain Chen explained during one of these planning sessions is that diversity isn't something to be managed or accommodated. It's a strategic advantage that makes all of us more capable than any of us could be alone. She gestured to the mixed species teams working throughout the converted facility. Look at what we've accomplished here. Human creativity, Voidstalker precision, Zeraki technological innovation, Krellian systematic analysis. Each species contributes unique capabilities that enhance everyone else's effectiveness. Zarthek observed the truth of her statement in the daily operations of their integrated teams. Problems that would have challenged any single species were being solved routinely through collaborative approaches that combined different perspectives and capabilities. But more importantly, the personnel involved in these collaborations were developing relationships that transcended professional necessity. They were becoming friends, colleagues, and genuine partners in ways that created bonds stronger than any formal alliance. "Captain," he said, "I believe what we're creating here represents more than just effective interspecies cooperation. We're demonstrating that different civilizations can truly integrate rather than simply coexist." Chen's smile reflected satisfaction at seeing him reach that conclusion. "Commander, that's exactly what humanity hoped to achieve when we joined the coalition. Not just membership in a galactic alliance, but partnership in building something greater than what any of us could create alone." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent alert from the facility sensor array. Long-range detection systems had identified an approaching vessel of unknown configuration, moving at speeds that exceeded current propulsion technology by significant margins. Initial analysis suggested the craft was neither coalition nor devourer in origin, but represented a completely unknown technology base. More concerning, its approach vector indicated it would reach their position within hours, and it was actively scanning their facility with sensors that defied current understanding of physics. "All personnel to alert stations," Zarthek commanded, his mind automatically shifting to tactical assessment mode. "Prepare defensive measures and establish contact protocols for unknown contact." But as coalition and human forces moved to implement standard first contact procedures, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of following established protocols that emphasized caution, defensive positioning, and careful diplomatic approach, the mixed species teams began implementing responses that reflected human tactical thinking applied to diplomatic challenges.
"Commander," called Sergeant Santos from her position at the communications station, "we're receiving a transmission from the unknown vessel."
But it's not using standard diplomatic frequencies or protocols. They're broadcasting on multiple channels simultaneously, including some that shouldn't be physically possible. The transmission, when decoded, revealed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the war they thought they had won. The message came from representatives of a coalition of species that existed beyond the galactic rim, civilizations that had been fighting the Devourers for millennia, rather than the months that marked coalition experience. "Coalition forces," the transmission began, "we are the Eternal Vigil, survivors of civilizations consumed by the entities you call Devourers. We have monitored your recent conflicts and observed tactical approaches that suggest you have achieved something we thought impossible, victory through integration rather than conquest." The implications struck the assembled officers with immediate clarity. The Devourers represented a galactic-scale threat that extended far beyond local space. But more significantly, their recent victory had attracted attention from civilizations that possessed capabilities and experience that dwarfed anything in coalition knowledge. Admiral Theron's voice crackled across the communications system as he addressed both the unknown contact and the facility personnel. "Eternal Vigil, this is Coalition Admiral Theron. We welcome contact and offer whatever assistance our capabilities allow." The response revealed information that fundamentally altered their understanding of the conflict they had experienced. "Admiral Theron, our observations suggest that your alliance has developed countermeasures against Devourer adaptation that we have been unable to achieve despite centuries of warfare. We request permission to study your tactical methodologies and offer our knowledge in exchange." What followed was a series of discussions that revealed the true scope of the threat they had faced and the significance of their victory. The Devourers weren't just a local phenomenon. They were part of a pattern of consumption that had been spreading across the galaxy for thousands of years, eliminating entire civilizations through systematic analysis and adaptation. The Eternal Vigil represented the survivors of that process, species that had managed to avoid complete consumption but had been forced to retreat to the galactic periphery, fighting a defensive war against an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat permanently.
"What we could not understand," explained Commander Vextar, the Eternal Vigil representative who had established primary contact, "was how your alliance achieved tactical effectiveness against an enemy that had adapted to counter every approach we attempted." Captain Chen's response revealed the fundamental difference between coalition tactics and traditional military approaches.
Commander Vexstar, we succeeded because we weren't fighting primarily to defeat the enemy, we were fighting to protect what mattered to us. And when you fight for something more important than tactical victory, you become capable of achieving objectives that pure military efficiency can't accomplish. The exchange that followed provided insight into why previous civilizations had failed against the Devourers while the Coalition had succeeded. Traditional military approaches focused on optimization, efficiency, and logical tactical development. The Devourers' analytical capabilities allowed them to understand and counter such approaches systematically. But human tactical thinking incorporated variables that analytical systems couldn't quantify: moral conviction, personal relationships, emotional investment, and willingness to sacrifice for others. These factors created unpredictability that transcended mere tactical randomness because they were based on values rather than calculations. More importantly, Chen continued, our effectiveness came from genuine cooperation between different species rather than just coordinated military action. When people from different backgrounds work together because they share common values, they create capabilities that exceed the sum of their individual strengths. Commander Vexstar's response indicated profound interest in understanding the mechanisms behind Coalition success. Captain Chen, are you suggesting that interspecies integration itself served as a tactical advantage against Devourer forces? Not just tactical, Chen replied. Strategic, psychological, and moral. When different species work together as genuine partners, they develop resilience and adaptability that analytical systems can't predict because it's based on relationships rather than algorithms. The conversation revealed that the Coalition's victory represented more than just local military success. It demonstrated approaches to interspecies cooperation that could potentially transform galactic civilization's ability to resist existential threats. Over the following days, as representatives from the Eternal Vigil integrated with Coalition personnel to study their methods, Zarthek witnessed something remarkable. Instead of the cautious, formal exchange of information that characterized traditional first contact situations, genuine friendships and working relationships developed rapidly between species that had never encountered each other before. The pattern was unmistakable and reflected principles he had learned from working alongside humans. When people focused on shared challenges and common values rather than differences and potential conflicts, cooperation developed naturally and effectively. But more significantly, the integration process revealed that the approaches they had developed fighting the Devourers could be applied to any situation requiring different groups to work together toward common objectives. The lessons learned in combat translated directly into enhanced effectiveness for exploration, research, development, and construction projects. Commander, Dr. Warren approached him as he observed mixed Coalition Eternal Vigil teams working on advanced propulsion research. I want to show you something that I think will interest you. She led him to a section of the facility where human psychologists were working with Eternal Vigil sociologists to analyze the factors that had made Coalition tactics effective against Devourer forces. Their preliminary findings revealed patterns that had implications extending far beyond military applications. What we're discovering, Dr. Warren explained, is that the same principles that made our military cooperation effective can be applied to virtually any collaborative endeavor. When people from different backgrounds work together based on shared values and mutual respect, they consistently achieve results that exceed theoretical projections. The research data supported observations that Zartek had made throughout his experience working with humans. Mixed species teams routinely outperformed single species groups on complex challenges, but only when the integration was based on genuine partnership rather than mere coordination. The key factor, Dr. Warren continued, appears to be what humans call caring about each other's success. When team members prioritize collective achievement over individual advancement, and when they value each other's welfare as individuals rather than just as functional contributors, the resulting collaboration becomes exponentially more effective. Lieutenant Torres, who had been observing the research, added perspective that illuminated the broader implications of their discoveries. What we're really talking about is the difference between alliance and friendship. Alliances are based on mutual benefit and can be dissolved when circumstances change. Friendships are based on mutual care and become stronger when circumstances become more challenging. The insight struck Zarthek with sudden clarity about the transformation he had experienced during the war. His relationship with human forces had evolved from professional alliance to genuine friendship, and that evolution had made him a more effective military officer, a better leader, and a more complete individual. Dr. Warren, he said, are you suggesting that the most effective approach to interspecies cooperation is to treat other species not as allies but as friends? I'm suggesting that friendship, Genuine care for each other's welfare and success creates capabilities that purely professional relationships can't achieve, she replied. And those capabilities become strategic advantages when facing challenges that require more than just coordinated effort. As the research project continued and integration between Coalition and Eternal Vigil civilizations deepened, Zarthek found himself contemplating the broader implications of what they were creating. The war against the Devourers had begun as a fight for survival, but it had evolved into something unprecedented in galactic history: genuine integration between different species based on shared values and mutual respect. The transformation represented more than just improved military effectiveness or enhanced technological capabilities. It demonstrated that different civilizations could work together to build something greater than what any of them could achieve alone, creating possibilities for exploration, discovery, and development that transcended anything previously imagined. During the facility's dedication ceremony, as representatives from dozens of species gathered to celebrate the completion of the galaxy's first truly integrated research station, Captain Chen delivered remarks that encapsulated everything Zartek had learned about humanity's contribution to galactic civilization. "What we've built here," she said, addressing the assembled delegates, "isn't just a research facility or a symbol of interspecies cooperation. It's proof that the galaxy's greatest strength isn't our technology or our military capabilities. It's our ability to care about each other as individuals and work together toward common goals that benefit everyone." She gestured to the mixed species teams that had made the project possible. Each species represented here brings unique capabilities and perspectives that enhance everyone else's effectiveness. But more importantly, the relationships we've built with each other create resilience and adaptability that no individual civilization could achieve alone. Admiral Theron's response reflected the fundamental change in coalition thinking that had emerged from their experience fighting alongside humans. "Captain Chen, what humanity has taught the coalition is that strength comes not from independence but from interdependence, from choosing to stand together not because we must, but because we value what we can become together." As the ceremony concluded and personnel returned to their ongoing projects, Zarthek found himself in conversation with Captain Chen about the future implications of what they had achieved. "Captain," he said, "I believe this facility represents something more significant than successful interspecies cooperation. It demonstrates that different civilizations can truly integrate rather than simply coexist." Chen's expression reflected satisfaction at seeing him reach that conclusion. "Commander, that's exactly what humanity hoped to achieve. Not just membership in galactic civilization, but partnership in creating the kind of galaxy where every species can flourish while contributing to something greater than themselves." As they watched the sunset through the facility's observation windows, Zarthek realized that his transformation from coalition officer to something greater was complete. The fear he had learned from fighting beside humans, the fear of losing sight of what made victory meaningful, had evolved into something more positive and powerful. It had become hope. Hope that different species could work together as genuine partners. Hope that diversity could become strength rather than simply challenge to be managed. Hope that the galaxy's civilizations could build something together that none of them could create alone. The war against the Devourers had ended, but what they had built in fighting that war together had opened possibilities that extended far beyond military victory. They had demonstrated that the greatest achievements came not from competition but from collaboration, not from dominance but from partnership, not from conquest but from friendship. And in teaching the galaxy that lesson, humanity had given them something more valuable than any weapon or technology. They had given them hope for what they could become together. That hope, Zarthek realized, was humanity's greatest gift to the universe, and it would continue to transform galactic civilization long after the immediate threats had been forgotten. The future stretched ahead, full of challenges and opportunities that no single species could face alone. But they would face those challenges together, as friends and partners united by shared values and mutual respect. And in that unity they had found something that made not just victory, but existence itself truly meaningful.